Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the third panel of the inaugural annual conference of the James A. Baker III Institute for Public Policy here at Rice University. As you know, the theme of this conference is Foreign Policy Challenges at the End of the Century. We have divided ourselves into three panels. We are now at that third panel. In some ways, it may very well be the most interesting of the three panels. I say that because we are dealing with cultural, ethnic, religious factors in international affairs. And for so much of our lives, we have been preoccupied by the Cold War, and we have lived with single determinants in figuring out the kind of policies that we would have. Single determinants defined as containment. But now, with the breakdown of the Cold War, the end of it, and we're in that period called the post-Cold War period, still to be defined, as we know from panels 1 and 2, we find that issues such as culture and ethnicity and religion are playing more central roles than they have ever played before. They played roles before, but they were not central roles. Our final panel thus addresses the roles of culture, ethnicity, and religion in world affairs. And this is a broad but central issue, and typically we tend to make foreign policy and commercial decisions without reference to the impact of culture and ethnicity and religion. Mistake. These factors can play a crucial role both in our countries and in countries around the world. Neglecting these factors could well lead to failed policies, and we believe that this is even more true now in the post-Cold War period. Our panelists will be asked to deal with both the general nature of the influence of these factors on world affairs and specific examples such as Bosnia, the Middle East, and Asia. Before I introduce the panelists, let me say, as I have for the other two panels, that we want to get your questions as well. And before you came in, there were opportunities for you to pick up question cards, fill them in the course of our panel discussion. Raise your hand with the card. Ushers will come by and pick them up from you, and then they'll be delivered to Ambassador Derejian. Now let me introduce our panelists. His Excellency Taro Nakayama, Foreign Minister of Japan from 1989 to 1991. He is currently chairman of the Japan-U.S. Parliamentarians Friendship League and is a leading member of the LDP in the Japanese Diet. Welcome, sir. Next, His Excellency Roland Dumas, twice serving as France's Minister of Foreign Affairs. Welcome once again, sir. Mrs. Dominique de Menil is a distinguished founder and president of Houston's Rothko Chapel, internationally recognized in promoting interfaith dialogue. Welcome, Madame. Dr. John Esposito, Professor of Religion and International Affairs at Georgetown University and Director of the Center for Muslim-Christian Understanding at the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service. Dr. Esposito, welcome. Ms. Judith Miller, a senior writer for the New York Times and author of a number of books, including One by One by One, a highly praised account of distortions of the memory of the Holocaust. Welcome, Ms. Miller. Dr. Benjamin Lee, Professor of Anthropology at Rice University and a former visiting professor at the University for Foreign Studies in Beijing. Welcome. Ms. Georgianne Geyer, a syndicated columnist, author, foreign correspondent, speaker, and educator. Welcome, Gigi. Dr. Samuel Heilman, Professor of Sociology at the City University of New York Graduate School and Queens College, and holder of the Harold Proshansky Chair in Jewish Studies. Welcome, Dr. Hellman. Dr. Martha Brill Olcott, Professor of Political Science at Colgate University, Senior Associate at the Carnegie Endowment for Peace, and an expert on Central Asia. Welcome. Dr. R. Scott Appleby is an Associate Professor of History at the University of Notre Dame, where he directs the Kushwa Center for the Study of American Catholicism and the Fundamentalism Project. Welcome, Dr. Appleby. And finally, Dr. James Piscatori, Senior Fellow for Muslim Politics at the Council on Foreign Relations. Thank you, Dr. Piscatori. The way I'll try to run this morning, as I said yesterday, what is the job of a moderator? It's to leave as little blood as possible, to be as fair as possible, to give everybody a shot, and do it in a nice, easy, friendly manner as all of us discuss the views that we all have on these subjects. And I would like to start with three members of our panel, Minister Nakayama, Minister Duma, and Madame de Menil, and we'll start with Minister Nakayama. Thank you, sir. Please.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to apologize. My English is not so good, so I'd like to make a speech in Japanese. My translator will translate in English.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is indeed an honor to be invited to speak at the inaugural annual conference of the Baker Institute. Now that the Cold War structure has ended, the world is exploring a new framework, and we see conflicts based on religious and ethnic confrontation, and conflicts are becoming more and more likely to occur. There are conflicts in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and there are various struggles that are taking place in the former Soviet Union. Military conflicts are taking place in the Middle East. Behind the various incidents that are occurring in these regions, there is confrontation, religious and ethnic confrontation behind these incidents. Recently, there was a tragic incident in Israel in which Prime Minister Rabin was killed. And the murderer confessed to having killed him. This was a Jewish man, and he had confessed to killing him by order of God. This kind of religious confrontation is not something that occurred today, and this has continued from ancient times. Christianity, Islam, and Buddhism are said to be the world's three major religions. Buddhism was started by the Buddha in the 5th century BC, Christianity in the 1st century by Jesus Christ, and Islam was started by Muhammad in the 7th century. Out of the 5.6 billion people that live around the world, approximately 900 million people are Roman Catholics, approximately 400 million Protestants, and approximately 900 million are Islamic. Approximately 300 million people are Buddhists, and approximately 700 million are followers of Hinduism. In any event, the religions of the world play an important role in international politics because of their borderless nature. In Japan, generally, religion has been thought of as something that brings salvation to the soul. The reason for religion playing a role in international politics has to do with the extremely political nature of religion. Think for a moment about how Christianity, Islam, and Buddhism were born and spread. These were times when poverty, inequity, and discrimination were rampant in society, and those who embarked on social reform thought of religion as a transformative power and were drawn by it, and thus became followers. Religion not only brought spiritual salvation, but became a revolutionary force that was a driving force behind the realization of ideals based on one's beliefs. As a medical doctor, when I look at the world today, I note that in Christian civilization of the West, organ transplants from brain-dead donors are actively performed. In Japan and other Asian countries, however, in spite of the well-established transplant techniques, organ transplants from brain-dead donors are not conducted.
Currently, I have submitted to the Japanese Diet the organ transplant bill. Although it has been a year and a half since I have my submission, the deliberation is not making much progress. Therefore, those patients who cannot be saved unless they have received a transplant, they go to the Western countries so that they could receive an organ transplant. In the Christian society, the soul of the dead are believed to be resurrected. Also, people feel that they could, to those who are suffering from disease, people are willing to extend their organs after their own death so that they could help and salvage other fellow citizens. However, in Japan, perhaps due to a long traditional sentiment of religious background, the human souls are considered to reside in hearts. And therefore, there has been some resistance against the removal of the organs or vital in the hearts from the brain death situation. This is a good example of how the religious background is affecting our modern-day life. There is a certain value differences between the Asian nations and Western nations. In Western nations, they seem to respect the rights of the individuals, whereas in Asian countries, we tend to respect the harmonization among the people, and I see some difference in this. Also, in Western society, it is more of a monotheistic, whereas in Asia, it is polytheistic. Unlike those Christian civilization in the Western countries, in Asia, there are Buddhism, Confucianism, Taoism, Islam, and Shinto, and Lama and other regional religions. In Western civilization, there is a value system which has been developed over several hundred years and which has reached to a certain accuracy and widely accepted in society at large. However, in Asia, I'm afraid there hasn't been an example of equivalent nature. In Asia, there are Buddhism, Taoism, Hinduism, and Confucianism, Islam, and Shinto. and Lama, these are all coexisting in Asia. It seems rather difficult to build a value system common among all Asian nations. And also we find in Asia a certain specific sort of a communalism or the ethnism and ultranationalism also. In the 20th century, science and technology has made a remarkable progress. So what we used to believe to be the doing of the God, those mysterious things, has been elucidated one after another. The mystery of the universe has gradually been unveiled, and the secret of the DNA has been unlocked, and this is contributing to the breeding technology. Human travel to the moon, communications, dissemination by satellite communication, nuclear power generation, all these have become a reality in this century. Every time the veil of the mystery has been taken away, those value system and ethics that we have been holding for many years have been changing. Right now, we can learn about any events on this earth via satellite, and we can obtain any information in digital form at any place. The recognition that the earth is a planet on which human beings live have been getting stronger among all of us. Any information all over the world can instantaneously be obtained via internet. People can communicate and exchange various information even during the transit using the cellular phone. Therefore, regardless of where we live on this world, we can learn about religious event and fashion or anything happening in any other part of the world. Gradually, the information upon this planet has become a common knowledge among all the people. Therefore, those ethnic culture and tradition which are particular to a certain country will become affected by various means of information technology. And this will certainly affect the values and ethics. For the sake of the 21st century, and also for the sake so that we could coexist on this earth, we will have to ask ourselves what is most important to us all. We will have to recognize this as something in common amongst all the people on this earth. The ethics of human society and the sense of morality will become more and more important along with the progress of scientific and technological advancement. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir. Minister Duma, your turn, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like would like to add a few words on what has been said by my distinguished colleague, Mr. Nakayama, former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Japan. We met several times and we know each other very well. After the discussion on economy, on war, peace, weapon, it's very important that we have time to discuss on culture. Could we, on culture and religion, could we imagine that we could live without culture? Since the beginning of the humanity, it is a necessity for life. And if we regard the history in old time, in Rome and Greeceland, the best period was a period of a great cultural exchange. I think personally that culture is a real factor of the progress of humanity, especially in our world, which is a world of technical developments, important one. And it is a necessity to recover our meaning regarding our origin, that is to say, what we have done before us, what the religion is worth. And more than the culture, I think in our world, the exchange of the culture is a necessity. Great necessity to know each other, to have exchange on the languages among the people, and I would make a compliment to all the organizers of this meeting, of this conference, that we are working in a place like the Rice University, which is the right place for this type of discussion. Well, the most important thing is the exchange of the culture. It means the exchange among the men. In France, everybody knows that we have a special policy for culture. And I would like to mention to you, because you have a different system here in the United States. The state in France is largely engaged in investment for culture. The last 10 years, we have made a lot of things regarding the Grand Travaux, the museum, and I think it is a necessity in our world from today to have an engagement of the states as far as possible. Certainly, it's a good thing that the private initiative took place in that field, but also the state should be present. Because, as I said, we live in a special world at the end of this century. And because we are talking about the end of this century, I think it is a necessity to mention it. And I would like to conclude on that point before leaving the floor to somebody who had made so much here in this place in Texas for the culture. I mean Madame de Menil. I would like to say, for concluding, that there is a special link between religion and the religion and the culture. The religion could be, the best or the worst thing. The best when it is a moral support for our society, sort of a moral containment that we have to live with. But it is the worst thing also when it becomes a mean for a certain regime to go to extremism and to be the contrary of what we hope to be with the culture. So we should be very cautious of this notion of religion and the use we can make with that. Religion, culture are the two faces of the same thing. And I'm very glad to be here today, after having spoken yesterday on war, to be able to say a few words on peace with the culture and through the culture. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. And now, my pleasure to introduce Mrs. Dominique de Menil.
Mr. Dumas, I quite agree with you that religion can be the worst or the best, but that, and I may touch on that. Ladies and gentlemen, just a few remarks. Creativity is indispensable in an ever-changing world, and our world is always changing. The clock can never be turned back, not even by a group of dedicated Israelis who want to occupy the same land as was occupied at the time of King David, the great Solomon. It ends up in disaster, as the murder of Yitzhak Rabin has reminded us of. I think it is urgent to involve the next generations, and I put it in the plural with an S, in the process of understanding the very grave problems of today and how to tackle them. Young people are naturally enthusiastic and eager to exercise their capabilities and their energy. Sadly, many doubt that improvements in the world are possible. They're afraid to come forth, and they withdraw into their own cultural group, which leads nowhere. Thus, they become selfish. Selfishness soon drives them to make fast money. And of course, the easiest way for people today who don't have special talent to make fast money is to become drug dealers. And once a drug dealer, you become an addict, and it's very difficult to quit. Often, it is a powerful domination of a sect that enables them to detoxify. But the remedy is pernicious. It may be even as bad as a disease. Let's remember of the Johnstown massacre, and more recently of the Davidian cult with David Koresh. But wise, warm, and charismatic voices, with the grace of God, make themselves heard from time to time. Towards the end of the 19th century, a great pope, Leo XIII, proclaimed new realities in a famous encyclical, Rerum Novarum, in 1891. And the new realities were the industrialization of the 19th century and the miserable, the unjust conditions of workers. Leo XIII shook the world and shocked part of the world too. Closer to us, Pope John XXIII also shook and shocked the world by launching the Council of Vatican II. His last message was his encyclical letter, Peace on Earth, Pacem in Terris, in 1963. His words were so wonderful that they still resound with exceptional force. They were addressed to all men of goodwill. They call for an order founded on truth, built according to justice, vivified and integrated by charity, and put into practice in freedom. Voila.
Voila, indeed. Thank you very much. Thank you, Madame. We now have an opportunity to listen to the other 8 panelists who will not speak as leisurely as the first 3 did. And I will call upon them all, starting with Dr. John Esposito.
Thank you very much. I promised my colleagues to both be brief as well as not say what they were going to say, which is going to be very interesting. In a post-Cold War period, while some initially spoke of a new world order, many others saw a new disorder. For, as we've seen even in this conference, to talk about a post-Cold War period in which interstate conflict may not be as prominent is not to overlook the fact that increasingly it is indeed intrastate conflicts of religion, ethnicity, nationalism, consisting of militias, extremist groups of every type. This is the world to which individual citizens, nations, and indeed multinational corporations must address themselves. It is a world, if we look today, which sees that from Egypt and Algeria to Pakistan, Afghanistan, Kashmir, and the southern Philippines, we see conflicts. But it's not only in the Middle East or Latin America, Africa, South and Southeast Asia, but indeed sporadically in Europe, the US, Japan, and most recently and tragically in Israel. Part of what we do see needs to be seen within the context of a global religious resurgence. It cuts across all religions and many parts of the world, a resurgence of religion in personal and public life. The public life aspect often seeing greater emphasis on political and social activism, whether it's Islamic groups, Jewish groups, groups in Sri Lanka, those engaging in political action, those establishing clinics and hospitals. We see it reflected in new opposition movements and emerging alternative elites. If we underestimated in the past the role of religion in international affairs, we must avoid overemphasizing and too quickly jumping to talking about a clash of civilizations between the West and China and the Islamic world, or an Islamic threat. It seems to me we must not forget what we share, and that the vast majority of people, indeed in the world, share in their diverse faiths common principles and values which enable us to take a much more positive and constructive approach to the world and its development. And indeed, beyond that, just very practically, peoples have always learned to function in terms of their national interest and local interest. So in conclusion, what are some of the challenges that we face? It seems to me that we continue to pursue the concerns of the old order, which remain relevant, but see and respond to the new challenges, to distinguish between violent extremists and moderate religious activists. The assassins of Mr. Rabin and supporters of such extremists and other extremists in the Muslim world or in the US are a minority, and we need to keep that in mind. They are a dangerous minority, and a minority that needs to be contained. We need to realize, though, that religious nationalism, for example, enjoys the support of moderates as well as extremists, whether in the Arab world, Israel, South and Southeast Asia. And we cannot simply paint those who have a religious nationalist view of the world as simply being the enemy. While radicalism must be eliminated and contained, we have to avoid, it seems to me, new forms of neo-imperialism, McCarthyism, and repression that can lead to radicalization. The US and Europe, therefore, are challenged to find new paths somewhere between being the world's policeman and neo-isolationism. To work with established governments but be open to populist movements and alternative elites will indeed be difficult. To work with authoritarian regimes when necessary, when national interests require it, but to promote those values and conditions that will encourage the long-term development of strong civil societies, that will foster notions of self-determination, political participation, pluralism, and human rights, it seems to me are at sometimes almost incomparable hurdles, but hurdles that we need to address and indeed get over. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Excellent. Dr. James Piscatori, please.
Thank you. I have 5 points which I wanted to emphasize. The first is that modernization has most often left people with a sense of loss rather than achievement. The wide disparities of wealth, the urban-rural imbalances, unchecked demographic growth, and corruption. Far from a straight line towards progress and secularization, therefore, modernization has stimulated discontents, and it is in these discontents that we have religion and ethnicity defining identities for many people in the third world as well as the developed world. Sometimes these identities overlap, and ethnicity and religion should not be seen as discrete and separable categories sometimes. How does one distinguish the ethnic and religious components of being a Sikh or a Jew, a Tibetan, or an East Timorese? The second point is that there is not only dissatisfaction, with the socioeconomic and political conditions in society, but dissatisfaction with established religious hierarchies and institutional religious bodies, in large part the result of educational developments. There has been a fragmentation of authority in most religious traditions. Who speaks for Islam? Who speaks for Judaism? We know we have liberation theology challenging, standing in its sense as an indictment of the established church. We have Islamist groups in opposition to the traditional mullahs and other religious authorities. We have one rabbi contesting another rabbi's authority. The third point is that the politicization of religion does not pose a serious threat to global order, in my mind, in terms of internationally coordinated action against the West. Pan-Islamic institutionalization is largely illusory, and the Iranian threat, while it indeed is substantial, can be overstated. The differences that exist among Islamic states and movements are often profound. The fourth point is that even though this may be the case, transnational connections do exist across the borders of the world. The Sikhs in Canada and in Britain have supported the struggle for Khalistan in India, and we know that the connections between Sheikh Umar Abdul Rahman in the United States and Egypt are intense. The relations between what once might have been called the center and the periphery have sometimes been stood on their head, and what is going on in supposedly minority situations, that is, Muslims living in France or Britain or the United States, may be just as important, if not more so, than what is going on in majority Muslim countries. And this can be in a negative and in a positive sense. Negative in the sense of supplying funds and other kinds of assistance to movements in the Middle East from bases in the United States or from France or from Britain, but also positive in the sense that Muslims particularly are having now to live permanently in democratic societies and will have to come to terms with democratic participatory ideas. The fifth is that religion, if it is primarily at work in the world, is perhaps at work in civil societies or internally, but that clearly there can be spillovers into world politics. And here again, there's a positive and a negative side. Much of what is going on in religious traditions, whether it's the base ecclesiastical communities of Latin America or the religious movements of Islam, is really concerned with building community, it's concerned with social welfare activities. But negatively as well, it must be said that the condemnation of both political and religious establishments, this form of fragmentation of authority plus condemnation of existing authority, may have its own logic of proliferation and its own logic of radicalism. If you presume to take upon yourselves the right to speak for the religious tradition, you in a sense are delegitimizing, devalidating others to do so, and a spiral of violence may unfold, as we have seen so tragically in many parts of the world. And just very briefly, what policy implications might we be able to draw from this for the United States and from the West? It seems to me three. First, the need, as John Esposito said, to distinguish between movements, between their ideologies and their goals, and to accept that there are real differences among Muslims and other religious followers. Secondly, we need to pay attention to the manifestations of world religions in our own societies. How important Islam now has become to France, to Britain, and to the United States needs to be at the forefront of our minds perhaps all the time. It is not Islam versus the West, of course, it is Islam in the West, which is now politically salient. And finally, we need to be able to consider how to redress the harsher edges of the developmental modernization process, and perhaps in this way to try to break some of the harsher, more radical edges of fundamentalism. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Judy Miller.
As I sat here listening yesterday to the effort to define this post-Cold War era, I went around and asked some of my colleagues what they thought it should be called. Secretary Baker said it should be called the era of selective engagement or principled pragmatism. And Paul Wolfowitz said, well, let's just call it the Asian era. I want to call it the era of tribal and religious passion, because that's what my new book is about, Islamic militant passion. And I also want to focus on it because it has really transformed political life in the region, the Middle East, that I have covered for the past 20 years. Now, I agree with some of what has been said here today, but I have to disagree with other parts of it. I have long been searching for a, quote, moderate Islamic movement, but I find it's a little like searching for a socialist free market system. Militancy, by definition, is intolerant. If you wish to establish a state in which Islam rules, it means that people who happen not to share that belief and that faith will not be equal citizens in such a state. And in fact, that is one of the major problems with all of these movements. They do not afford equal legal status to people who happen to be Christian or Jews or non-Muslims. And that is true no matter where we find these movements in the Middle East. So even though I'm against making generalizations, sometimes you have to look at a cow and say it has 4 legs and it goes moo, and it's a cow. Another problem with a lot of these movements is that they tend to be anti-democratic. They believe that sovereignty, hukmiyah, resides in God. God wrote the holy book, the Quran. It has to be only interpreted by man. Man does not make law. This places an enormous burden on this text, which, even though it may be inspired, was written in the 7th century. And there are new problems and new challenges awaiting us. Finally, I'm not a political scientist, and thank the Lord I'm not a policymaker, because I think they really have a difficult task ahead. But I'm a simple journalist. I go around and interview people, and I know a racket when I see one. And to me, a lot of these movements are simply political movements, authoritarian political movements that wrap themselves in theological terminology and jargon that appeals to people, particularly uneducated people, even though they themselves happen not to be uneducated. Many of them are educated in Western institutions. And in the 2 countries in which I have lived and worked, Iran and Sudan, these are the only 2 examples of Islamic states, ostensible Islamic states that we have. I can tell you they're both failures and disasters. They are not democracies. Sudan is a police state with God that's murdering Christians in the south. And Iran, even though it continues to be a very dynamic place, is really a failed society now, which is desperately searching for a way to resecularize politics, to send the mullahs back to Qum so that the enormously talented Iranians who still believe in their country can get on with the issue of development. In short, I just want to say I think we should try to distinguish between moderate and radical groups, but I think we ought to not have any illusions about what their ultimate goals are. Yes, the rules of participating in democracies may shape and change them and, quote, moderate them, but they are not moderate. And ultimately, I hope for a region in which I've worked and the people with whom I both love and respect and have a great deal of faith in, that they will not go down what is a great historical detour. As they've learned in Iran and Sudan, there's no such thing as an Islamic car. The issue for all of us ahead, and for these societies in particular, is development. There are no purely Islamic answers to that. It's going to need the imagination and the resources of all people in that society, and the creativity, as Mrs. de Menil pointed out. And part of the problem with these movements is that the one thing they aim at is crushing creativity and ideas that disagree with theirs. So I hope that my colleagues will be able to leave you with a more optimistic view than I can, but I can only tell you that when I find a moderate Islamist, I will join forces with the people who are developing socialist free markets, and then we can all leave here in complete agreement. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Miller. Dr. Appleby.
I like much of what Judy Miller said, but I disagree strongly with one line, which was most of these movements are basically political or social movements with a religious coding. I believe that assumption is at the base of many of our failures in understanding these movements. Yesterday, Secretary Baker in his opening remarks said we live in a post-Cold War era, an era that's defined by what went before. Well, we come after not only the Cold War, but we come after the death of 241 Marines in Lebanon due to Hezbollah truck bombing. We come after Muslim-Hindu riots in India, the assassinations of Sadat and Rabin, religiously inspired, at least in part religiously inspired wars in Algeria, Sudan, Afghanistan, and many other places in the world. We come in an era after culture wars in Israel have teamed over with violence, after the World Trade Center bombing, after Hamas. And to dismiss these movements as the old type or another version of a political or social movement that happens to have a religious patina is a big mistake. This is not a new Cold War. It is not the West versus Islam or Judaism or any other religious movement. But because of the new technologies we talked about yesterday and the availability of these technologies and military options for small fragmented movements, it only takes a small minority within a religious movement or group to make a difference, the cumulative impact of which is not a Cold War perhaps, but a serious policy challenge for the West, wherever it may reside civilizationally. When we were in the Cold War, we had many Sovietologists whose job it was to look at, discern, watch the wrinkles in the profile of the Soviets and to understand what their sometimes obscure gestures might mean for policy. I think it's the case that in our own government we've been very slow to incorporate experts on religion into our foreign policy establishment. And we've had a series of failures because the assumption has been that these movements can be handled by Arabists working without specialists, say, in Islam at the senior levels of advising. That's why the Baker Institute, I feel, is such a welcome presence on the scene, especially when it's going to be led by Ed Dirigian, whose Meridian House address was one of the most sophisticated analyses of political Islam that we've heard from our government. So it's a very positive step, and there needs to be more incorporation of Muslims and others who are from these traditions or expert in them in our foreign policy deliberations. Let me conclude with 3 reasons why it's difficult to incorporate religion into our understanding of what's going on around the world. We don't think in the terms of many folks around the world when they understand religion. I'm going to need audience participation on this one. By a show of hands, how many of you prayed today? Okay, I'd say 40%. By a show of hands, how many of you think it's none of my business? This makes an important point. The second question is more important. In the West, most Americans will say it's none of my business what you do in your private life of worship. And there is a private-public distinction that has been entrenched in our institutions and our assumptions and our way of life in the West. And so when we Americans or other Westerners try to understand what it's like in most of the rest of the world where this distinction is not so firmly institutionalized, where religion and politics, where prayer and decisions about every realm in life are one, then it's easy for us to dismiss, compartmentalize, privatize those religious callings and those religious obligations. What we have trouble understanding, and it's not, in some ways, the Soviets were easier to understand because they didn't think, thank God, that the world might end tomorrow with the coming of the Messiah. If they had, their fingers on the button would have been much more threatening than some of the groups we face now. They are a minority, these folks who we face, these people who are on the other side of what people call a culture wars divide. But the first challenge we face is that there's a different epistemology out there, a different way of knowing, a different source for knowledge, for policy, for raising a family, and this source is seen as authentic, and as Jim Piscatori was saying, it's the one thing left that's still working, that's still meaningful. It's difficult for us in the West to understand how fully immersed people are in this alternative way of knowing that would lead them to actions we find irrational or perhaps politically motivated at the most. Second problem in trying to understand fundamentalist or militant religion is that the kind of religion that causes the problems is just one part of the religious profile, and that's the absolutist, non-compromising part. When we want to negotiate or deal with these people, we find that they have a worldview that allows of no compromise with us. In fact, it's reinforced by stubborn opposition to the enemy. And so when we look for things to negotiate with and for things that might be appealing, we're talking to a completely different mindset. That makes negotiation difficult and adds certain kinds of challenges we haven't faced before, perhaps. Finally, religion, despite what the fundamentalists make of it, is not univocal or monolithic. It's not just about war and opposition against the non-believers. It's not just about rendering the tradition one way. On the contrary, it's pluralist. And this is the one thing the fundamentalists are against. They're against pluralism not only in other cultures, but also in their own, and also within their religious tradition. Their job, their task is to render their tradition in one voice and to denounce the pluralism within it. The vast majority of Muslims, of Jews, of Christians are at home with this rich, ambiguous pluralism, and that's really what religion means to most people. But it's the fundamentalist task to deny this part of religion. So the public policy implication about differentiating among religious movements has to be kept in mind. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Benjamin Lee.
This paper is a report on a project to be coordinated by Rice University in cooperation with colleagues from mainland China, Taiwan, and Hong Kong. Our objective is to examine how the internationalization of culture and communication is transforming the potential relations among nationalism, democracy, and civil society in the Greater China region consisting of mainland China, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, and the overseas Chinese diasporas. Since the end of World War II, but especially accelerating after 1968, and the development of new social movements across the world, a globalized communications infrastructure is producing notions of publicness and peoplehoods that challenge traditional models of nationalism. Instead of national movements creating nation-based social identities, we are also seeing transnational movements linking peoples across countries and regions along shared interests such as women's issues, the environment, Hindu nationalisms, or even pan-Chinese Neo-Confucianism. In the case of post-Tiananmen China, the rapid pace of commercialization is producing a very different structure of social and cultural criticism than in 1989. The success of Deng's economic policies has resulted in the loosening up of the work unit or danwei system, which regulated employment, housing, education, and medical support. Many people have left their work units to pursue individual enterprises or maintain a nominal presence in order to keep housing benefits while working at other jobs. In addition to the explosion of gossip magazines and sexy tabloids, there are several new magazines in Beijing which reflect the development of various cultural niches. One, Shenghuo or Life magazine, self-consciously imitates the American Life magazine, while Aiyue or Philharmonic is the first audiophile magazine in China with a circulation of over 5,000 in Beijing alone. Along with television soap operas such as Kowang or Yearnings and Benji Budagushi, stories from an editor's bureau, a kind of Chinese Murphy Brown, a new mass-mediated and commercial public is being created. The production models for these soap operas and movies often come from abroad and are heavily influenced by similar products in Taiwan and Hong Kong. While what they all share in common is the discovery of values of everyday life. This stands in stark contrast to earlier works which portray communist heroes overcoming incredible hardships. Among elite intellectuals, there has been an increased circulation abroad, especially by those who have a command of English. Indeed, many of the graduate students who went abroad right before or after Tiananmen have received their degrees, and some have returned to China or Hong Kong. Along with their counterparts from Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore, they are forming a transnational Chinese intelligentsia which will shape the future direction of Chinese social and cultural criticism. Commercialism has thus introduced the possibility of institutions of cultural criticism relatively independent from the state, which are also increasingly part of a pan-Chinese cultural sphere. At the same time, the emphasis on values of everyday life shared across these regions creates the image of a contemporary Chineseness that crosses national boundaries. As we saw with the Beijing's Women's Conference, there are now local, subnational constituencies in mainland China for the new social movements which are seeping across the globe. The greatest irony of all may be that it is in this new wave of people-making that is creating the institutional conditions necessary for developing those, quote, uniquely Chinese values necessary for China to adapt to the processes transforming it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Martha Brill Olcott.
Thank you very much. While it's impossible not to be concerned about the extremist acts that seem ever so common in our post-Cold War world, I think we must remember that words are very, very powerful, and to label someone as a nationalist or a fundamentalist is to discredit them in the eyes of the international community. Because of that, I want to emphasize or repeat a point that has been made by several of my colleagues, that we shouldn't confuse different types of political and religious movements with one another. Events in Yugoslavia should not be seen as a predictor of Russia's future. Bosnia and Chechnya have very, very different causes. Even more so, events in the Middle East don't predict the future of Central Asia, and it's about the Central Asian states that I'd like to spend the rest of my few minutes talking. Central Asia, the 5 states of Central Asia, face very different challenges and are engaged in very different processes right now than we see going on in the Middle East. They're creating the first post-colonial states that this region has seen. And these states are today still headed by the communist-era elite that have now turned into nation builders. And it is this elite that is trying to arbitrate the return of religion to public life. And they, of course, have a very particular understanding of what religion is and what role it has played or should play in these societies. Simultaneously, these elites are trying to assert control over vast energy and other mineral resources in these societies. And these prizes are very great indeed. And their interest in having us help them develop these resources, of course, is what makes this area of interest and importance to us. If we're going to succeed in working in this part of the world, I think we have to understand the complexity of these societies and the complexity of the crises of state building that all Soviet successor states are engaged in, as well as the specific forms it takes in these societies. These societies have layers of political and ethnic values, as well as various layers of national and religious consciousness intermingled throughout each of these societies and the region as a whole. And it's going to be very, very hard for us to get our bearings with such a complex such a complex system of highways for which we're still seeking a roadmap. We must, as a result, be aware of the biases of those who seek to guide us through this very complex terrain, and be suspicious of the labels that they offer their political opponents in speaking with us. The demand made by a political group, a religious group, that government offices switch official closing date from Sunday to Friday need not be seen as a revolutionary or heretical act. It is not an easy step to go from this to a religious theocracy, to go from having Sunday as a closing date, which after all had its origins in Christianity in our Western societies, in these Muslim societies, is but a recognition of the historic role played by the dominant religious faith. Yet, if a group is labeled as nationalist or fundamentalist, they are discredited before potential Western partners. And by discrediting them, of course, we are strengthening the perceived legitimacy of the current elite. Similarly, claims are often made about the instability of this region, how even the current elite is incapable of running the region indefinitely. And these claims, made oftentimes by neighboring Russia, further legitimates Russia's own geopolitical aims in the region. Central Asia today is among the most stable areas of the former Soviet Union. My last 2 points. This stability being here notwithstanding, the end of the USSR has begun a process of political empowerment throughout these new states. Whether we see these processes as democratic or not, whether they are democratic in terms we understand them or not, there is still a process that's going on whereby the people of these societies are beginning to define their own post-Soviet national cultures. And in doing so, virtually all these societies are becoming more politically pluralistic. As a result, it is they, in the end, which will define who is a leader in the future. What are the qualities of leadership among the new generation of leaders that will eventually come to run these new states? And it is here that we really have the risk of real instability if the population is not involved in this process of defining the new national culture and the role of religion. What then can we give as advice for future policymakers and current policymakers? If the U.S. interest is to maximize our long-term advantage in the region, then we should be content in this interim period with only serving as subtle political influences. Because the process that these states face in the next stage is the greatest crisis that they're likely to have before them, which is the crisis of secession from this post-Soviet leadership and the crisis of bringing a new generation of leaders into power. It is then, I think, that we have to be prepared to maximize our position in these societies and to be able to work comfortably with whichever kind of national leader, presuming they are, of course, tolerant, that comes to be defined as the representative of these national cultures. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Oker. Georgie Ann Geyer.
Thank you, Marvin. Why has culture, and thus ethnicity and religion, become such a major new player suddenly in foreign policy? I think several reasons. The decolonialization after World War II, development became a possibility for all peoples for the first time in history. With that came the question of amenable cultural values. Of course, the end of the Cold War. The centers were not holding anymore. The Angolas of the world were suddenly free out there with no center like Moscow, or I must say like Washington in many cases. Related to that, the centers of ideological inspiration falling, people fell back on what they knew: religion, ethnicity, clans, sex. Militias became the new armies. And in some cases, some developing nations simply went too fast. A friend of mine was at the Shah's 2,500th anniversary at Persepolis in the early 70s, and he was standing with the Minister of Development of Iran, looking out over this desert, and there was this very primitive tribesman. And my friend said to the minister, "What are you going to do with that man?" And the minister said, "We are going to traumatize him into modernity." Well, that's not exactly the way it turned out. But ladies and gentlemen, in my 2 minutes, I want to say something that I think is very important. I'm going to use Bosnia as my case study. Even given those points, I can say, and along with Judy, with whom I agree very much, most of what we are thinking of as, quote, ethnicity, unquote, in the world today is a fraud. These are not, let's stick with Bosnia, not essentially an ethnic problem. It was not spontaneous. It was not unavoidable. And it was not inevitable. It did not bubble up from nowhere. It was planned, plotted, orchestrated by the men in Belgrade. It is a classical case of unscrupulous, ruthless men at the center using old ethnic hatreds, reawakening them, bringing them back to life. And of course, once they're brought back to life, they are indeed there. Ladies and gentlemen, I went to Belgrade from East Berlin in the fall of 1989. Just before the wall fell, I saw the last big anti-communist demonstrations. And I immediately took Yugoslav Airlines and I went to Belgrade. Why? Because my love of history and my journalist instinct told me this is the next place. This is going to be the model of disintegration. I'm very glad I went because I watched it being done, and everybody knew it was being done in Belgrade. Milosevic, the Serbian president, was using the economic collapse. He was forming the militias, he was arming the militias, he was sending arms all over the country, he was sending fanaticized young Serbs to fanaticize others, and I watched hour after hour of propaganda on television that would have made Hitler's minions quite jealous of the cleverness of it. I then went back every 6 months because I wanted to use Bosnia, I wanted to use the post-Yugoslav situation as my model. And of course, it is a terrible, terrible model. What happened there, ladies and gentlemen, was a tremendous mismatch of passions and power. You had Milosevic and his people who were the mountain Serbs, not the city Serbs, who were the thugs and criminalization is something we should really get into here in the entire world. They were fighting as vicious a war as the Nazis or any of the worst dictators in history. But who were they up against? They were up against a very odd configuration of people, the UN neutralists, the pacifists, the gradualists. And it was just incredible in those days to go into Zagreb, talk to the UN, as I always did, and go into these very, very abstract and sinuous discussions about neutralism and how far they could go while the Serbs were rampaging through the countryside. I talked in those years to Boutros-Ghali, whom I have a lot of respect for, but we disagree on this, and he would explain the neutralism position of the UN. It sounds very good, but it doesn't look very good when you get it up against a rampaging war. And he said to me once, the spring of '94, I think it was, he said, well, Georgianne, if we take action there, if we get involved, we would have to leave the country. And shortly after that, I was in Zagreb, and I talked to Mr. Akashi, the special representative, and he said if we use force, we would have failed. Well, that summer in July, I was talking to some of the UN guys in Zagreb, all very good people, not bad people. That's the terrible thing about this. And I was quoting these two quotes on neutralism from their two leaders. We're sitting around a table, and I said, honestly, confused, I said, but if you're not going to use force ever, why did you bring NATO in? And they all looked down at the table. And then I repeated it, and I said, why did you bring NATO in then? And they all looked down at the table. And I said, it suddenly hit me, and I said, oh my God, you never intended to use it. And they admitted, no, it was a way to try to scare the Serbs. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I could go on all day about Bosnia, but I can assure you that if we had time, I could not only prove to you that this was largely a power grab, it was a way to stay in power, it was a political thing and not an ethnic fight. But I would say that if you look carefully, you see the same pattern in many of the, quote, ethnic wars. You see it in Rwanda, you see it in Nagorno-Karabakh. So I think we should stop saying that there is no strategy after the Cold War. I think rather we should try to form groups like Ruth Benedict's group in the Defense Department during World War II, who did a brilliant book on Japan's culture, Chrysanthemum and the Sword, so we could deal with Japan intelligently. We have nobody, we have no group like that today. And I think we should also understand that all of these situations, including these, quote, ethnic, unquote, wars, which we see across the globe, can be rather easily understood. It's not a problem of strategy, ladies and gentlemen. It's a problem of principle. I hate to say it, but at present, we do not have a foreign policy based on principle. We had it under Secretary Baker, and that's why it works so well. Thank you.
Thank you, Gigi. Thank you very much, Gigi. Professor Heilman, please.
Thank you. I'd like to refocus a bit on the matter of religion and, of course, speak telegraphically, so the nuance and the kinds of comments that I want to make will, of course, be lost, but trust me that they are there. I think we need to begin to recall that we're talking about people who take religion very seriously. The notion that nation states assumed, the notion that perhaps, as the 19th century sociologist once put it, the old gods are dead or dying, was mistaken. We have found at the end of this century that there is a profound staying power of religion, and that religion, particularly among those who take it enormously seriously, sets itself up as a genuine counterculture to secularity, to, in fact, democratic principles, insofar as democratic principles assume that we are all free to do as we please if enough of us agree to do that. The religious point of view says that that is not necessarily the case, that we answer to a higher authority. It sets itself up as a counterculture to realpolitik. Religion often, in fact, finds itself in a contest for hearts and minds. It is no longer satisfied, as my colleague Scott Appleby put it, to compartmentalize itself. It is no longer satisfied to make part-time claims. And unlike secular powers, it often equates compromise and negotiation with heresy, and therefore sees it as unthinkable. The fate of one's soul depends upon the decisions that are made, and those decisions made have to be guided very often by divine will. Now, these may not be the ways that we in this room are often comfortable in thinking, but they do make up the kind of thinking that is very often at the heart of the religious worldview and ethos. Moreover, the essential requirements that the gods make are often to be interpreted not by the individual alone, but by religious leaders, be they mullahs, rabbis, priests, and the like, who now stand as rival powers with the temporal powers, and often rivals with one another. And so, in a sense, every individual who is so deeply religious is looking for that particular set of interpreters whose word now becomes tantamount, even more important very often, than written law. Moreover, the problem very often is that these religious leaders who draw their wisdom from all sorts of different domains are nevertheless making decisions in the temporal domain. So that rabbis are deciding about foreign policy in the land of Israel, mullahs are deciding about foreign policy in Islamic countries, and preachers and ministers are deciding both about foreign and domestic policy very often in the West. For the religious, who are often ethnically connected and identified, and I think it's been correctly pointed out by several of the colleagues on the panel that the lines between ethnicity and religion do become blurred, those who share their faith are often considered special and chosen. And of course, that means that those who do not are holding an inferior position. The fact is, as has already been pointed out, that tolerance and pluralism, which we take so much for granted as a part of our ideals, are, to many of the religious worldview, who share the religious worldview, they are anathema, or a kind of secondary in importance. That is, that being a member of the world community, saying that I am a citizen of the planet Earth, my people are all people, is viewed, I think, by the religious worldview very often as a kind of assimilation. And that in opposition to that, the notion of separate ethnic, cultural, religious integrity or survival is predominant. It is more important that one's ethnic or religious group survive than all peoples survive. And I think perhaps to conclude, we need to understand that for many, that is, who share the religious point of view, there is a very distinct enemy, and that enemy is by and large equated with the West and Western civilization. It's viewed as a toxin. One reads about what's called West toxification, which means to many an absorption of what are viewed as the corrosive values of secularity and untamed freedom, which in the end leads to the most base instincts of humanity from that point of view. That is viewed as a toxin that grows, that very often comes in on the wings of technology, but that must be somehow inoculated against. Those who are infected with this toxin, who are secular, may be, sometimes must be liquidated. I think one sees that very clearly in the tragic events in Israel, but only most recently in Israel, and I'm afraid not for the last time, either there or elsewhere. If one does not see the light, one can be liquidated. A return to the fundamental ethnic, cultural, religious roots is required, and I don't think that this is only a cover for a political point of view. I believe that these are deeply held beliefs by people who are extraordinarily sincere and dedicated. They are making choices, they have a sense of ultimate values, and they do remain convinced that sectarian identities are the superior ones. They will fight back, and they'll fight back under two conditions. One, if they feel beleaguered, that the barbarians are at the gate, as people have already put it, that if they don't fight back now, they lose everything. Or, alternatively, they will fight back when they feel that the opposition is weak, when the guard is down, when the West seems to be in its moments of corrosion. Because they believe that history does have an end, they believe that they know what that end of history will be, and that they will be the winners at the end of history. Now, just very briefly in terms of policy, I think the first thing we have to do is to recognize this is a legitimate point of view. It's not going to go away. Religion is not going to die, and religious zealotry is not going to disappear. I think we have to allow room for these deeply held religious beliefs, but at the same time, those of us who do not necessarily share that point of view have to, while we leave room for it, at the same time, not only give the appearance of being strong, but make it very clear to those who hold this point of view that we are strong. It's quite all right for them to believe that at the end of time they will be dominant, but they have to realize that they must wait for their Messiah to come before they can take those actions, and they can't hurry up his coming. I think that in that case, they will remain quiescent, certain that history is on their side. I'm perfectly willing to allow the religious point of view its legitimacy, but not its dominance. We must compete in the marketplace of ideas, offer security, prosperity, dignity for the religious way of life, but at the same time maintain economic and political power that shows that tolerance and pluralism is the only possible strategy, even for those who are deeply religious. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Holman. Well, I think it's clear from what we have heard so far that simply convening a panel that would focus on religion, culture, and ethnicity would arouse new ideas and ideas that we had not been dealing with before. And I want to thank every single member of the panel for expressing his or her views as strongly and forcefully as you did. I heard any number of themes emerging here, but if there's a single one that comes into play, it was this conflict that seems to exist between the pluralism that is expressed by democracy and the discovery of truth as expressed by those who hold religion very dear to their souls. And the conflict between the two seems to widen the differences among people in a single civilization and diminish thereby the opportunities for peacefully resolving so many of the conflicts that exist around the world today. Now, that's my overall judgment, but I would like to give an opportunity now to any member of the panel to come up, state your case once again, take on one of your colleagues as forcefully as you wish, please.
I would just like to emphasize that unless we understand the nature of religion, we'll continue to have the kind of conversation that I think we often have about religion. The simple fact of it is that all religious traditions, while claiming at one level to be eternal and immutable, change. And so one can argue, for example, that traditional Judaism and Christianity were incompatible with modernity. In fact, what we see is a process of change within those religious traditions. Related to that is then the awareness that if we talk about even the process of modernization in the West, politically, economically, and religiously, if we look over the last few centuries, it was a process of reformations and revolutions, and that meant bloodshed. And depending on where we stand, we sometimes forget that. If you're an American, you forget that the way we see the American Revolution is not the way somebody else did. If you were raised as a Roman Catholic and an Italian, the way in which we saw the Reformation and the Protestant Reformation, and perhaps what Catholics did to Protestants, is a lot different from the way Protestants saw what happened to Catholics. Now, when it comes to understanding events in the Muslim world, and indeed in other traditions that are faced with this issue of modernization, the simple fact of it is, in much of the Muslim world, because of several centuries of colonialism, neo-colonialism, authoritarian governments that are in power and therefore control ideas and ideology and notions of civil society. For all those reasons, the sort of reformations and revolutions are just beginning to occur. Now, it is true, one can attempt to contain and even repress, but this is an inevitable process. And so I think the real challenge is to avoid any sense that says, if you just shut it down, everything will be fine.
Is anyone saying just shut it down, or is it simply a recognition of what it seeks to do, what it says?
Well, it depends on the it we're talking about. I think that what we need to realize is that issues of, for example, political power and authoritarianism are issues that are faced both in terms of secular leaders and religious leaders in many parts of the world that we look at. And I think that's what policymakers have to keep in mind in terms of long-term policy.
Professor Howman?
I think what we need to recognize here is that very often our political leaders have not been able to speak in the language of religion. And in this failure, they're unable to communicate with those people who do speak and think in the language of religion. That is, that people for whom this is a genuine attachment. To give an illustration, there's no question that for many of the settlers in Israel, religion is the single most important explanation for their activities. It gives them, as far as they're concerned, title to the land. It gives them, as far as they're concerned, a kind of program for action. Without understanding that particular language, one can't negotiate. There's a divide over which one cannot speak. I think part of what made it possible for some of these, and continues to make it possible for some of these zealots, to look upon the act of assassination as having some kind of legitimacy is because they viewed Yitzhak Rabin and the Labor government as unable to speak in the language of Jewish faith and not to understand their perspective until it is able to speak in those terms. Just as I think in this country, if the American government needs to speak in terms that religious believers in this country can identify with, there isn't going to be any kind of dialogue with these people.
Dr. Alcott?
The way you pose the tension is the conflict between democratic theory and sort of those who propose a theocratic worldview is an idealization of a conflict. I mean, this is how these conceptions are in conflict, as you correctly point out. But in most places where religious groups are trying to enter the political arena or opposing a challenge to a state, they're doing it in far from an idealized world, and the groups that are attacking them need not be any more tolerant than the religious groups themselves. I mean, at least in the post-Soviet world, there's a real question whether the minorities who are crying tyranny of the majority, if their vision of state building need not be any more tolerant, and often cases is no more tolerant than those who they claim are stamping out their rights. So
But in Soviet Central Asia, most of the authority there for the last 70 years has been in the hands of the Communist Party,
right.
people who claim no affinity whatever to religion. And yet, religion had a lasting power in that part of the world, and it's now rearing its head as the dominant challenge to the newly resurrected communist authority in that part of the world. Is that not right?
See, I would say it's not the dominant challenge, but the only remaining vocabulary that can be used in political protest in that part of the world. And one group...
Is that because there's nothing else?
Well,
is that what
because
you're saying?
there's not yet an agreement of what nationalism is, and in some of these states that are multi-ethnic, it's not clear what nationalism will even be. But the group that's screaming the loudest is oftentimes, in some of these states, the local Russians who are claiming that they don't want to live in a Muslim state, and it's not clear that their vision of what this quote-unquote multi-ethnic pluralistic state would be any more pluralistic than the still very undefined, not radicalized Islamic ideology that they're hollering about is such a big threat. I mean, you have to have, I think, some sort of definition of what an Islamic state is, which is really lacking in the context of Central Asia.
That's very interesting. Dr. Piscatori.
I think Judy Miller was right to flag for us the importance of pluralism as a problem in the Muslim world. And it does seem to me there is a problem with what I call the internal others. I mean, we have this endless debate about whether or not the other, the non-Muslim world, is acceptable. But in a sense, there are problems with three internal others: the status of non-Muslims within a Muslim society, status of women, and the status of political opponents. And, you know, one should say, quite frankly, the Muslim world, by and large, has not dealt with these very well. But at the same time, I think we can't just leave it there. I think we have to take just what Professor Olcott was suggesting and say that we've got to worry about setting up our categories of analysis as much too simple. It is not just simply the pluralists versus the anti-pluralists. It's not sort of the fundamentalists versus the free thinkers or the liberal thinkers. Part of the problem here is conceptual and definitional. To my mind, fundamentalism is a spectrum of activity, which ranges from the accommodators all the way to the really nasty, violent types. It is extremely difficult in many ways to decide where one fits on that spectrum, but there is a spectrum, and we should distinguish among those. So to my mind, we have to hold out the possibility that though there indeed has been a pretty woeful record on pluralism, the possibilities of accommodation given particular political circumstances can also be there. You know, one doesn't want to place one's whole case on so contentious a movement as Hezbollah. But you know, we think of Hezbollah, of course, for its violent activities against the Israelis and against the Lebanese state. All true, but it is also participating in parliament. It also has 8 members of parliament. Now, is that the wave of the future, or is the wave of the future the attacks on Israeli soldiers? I don't know. I really don't know. But I would open that there is a possibility for us of both of those occurring, and it's important for us to note the possibility of some form of accommodation with the system.
In Algeria, that very point that you're raising seems to be very much to the fore, and in France, people are very much concerned. Are they not, Minister Duma, that the more extremist, more fundamentalist people will come into power and then deny to all of the other factions the opportunity of expressing themselves? What is your view?
Yes, well, that's what I said when I said a few words that the religion could be the best or the worst. I would like to answer your question through a quotation. Everybody knows a very famous French writer, André Malraux. Not only was a writer, but he was the great minister of culture of General de Gaulle. He used to say, I will tell it in French first, le 21e siècle, le siècle suivant, sera religieux ou ne sera pas. The next century would be religious or won't be. I think Malraux meant two things. First of all, he understood that the religion would become a real force of the human life for the next century. Even more than that, a sort of factor of progress and not only an insurance for the people confronted to the mystery of death and life. But he understood another thing, and it meant another thing, that this could not happen. And in this case, if the humanity, instead of becoming a real religious society for the future, become a place for extremism, fundamentalism, fanatism, in that case, it would be a factor of destruction. And we can see before us recently, yesterday, in Saudi Arabia, few days in Jerusalem, that it could happen in next future. And I think it will be the real problem for the next 5 years. That's why I wanted to quote this expression of Malraux. It sounds, for me, now like a sort of prophecy. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. Miller and Appleby.
I think the job of the political scientist, as Jim Piscatori and Scott Appleby have done, is to really explore and define the spectrum of political activity that we are dealing with in a militant Islamic movement. And both Jim and Scott have done that brilliantly. And yes, there is a huge variety out there. There are people who want to create a very intolerant Islamic state through peaceful means, and there are other people who want to do it by blowing up American embassies. The goal is the same. The policymaker's job is to figure out how you can persuade the bomber at the American embassy to go into parliament, as Jim mentioned Hezbollah has done. How do you get that guy right over there into the spectrum of kind of legitimate political action? By the way, I think the journalist's role is to point out where everybody's lying. But one way of doing that is to give people incentives for participating in the political process. And one way to do that is to say, look, if you, Hezbollah, come in here and you play politics by our democratic rules, you can go to Brazil, you can have seats in Congress, you can have power, people will bow and scrape to you. These are all things that these people, being political men, and most of them are men, want. So that is a powerful incentive, but there also has to be a great stick. You set off that bomb, you assassinate that leader, and we will crush you. We don't want an accommodation with you. We don't want to speak in religious language because you are not a part of anything that is religious or politically acceptable. And I think that the goal of the policymakers in this country and overseas has to figure out how to do that, push the extremists into the moderate camp, and to draw a very firm line on what the civilized world will and will not tolerate. I'm just very glad that's not my job.
Thank you. Scott Appleby.
Let me try to bring together comments by John Esposito and the comment just made by Judy Miller in focusing on fundamentalism as a category of analysis. These fundamentalist leaders, it's not an either-or question. Either they're political or they're religious. Fundamentalists are, as John Esposito was saying, it's an innovative religious movement that's really somewhat unprecedented in that the leaders of these movements are very modern people who know how the world works. And in studying 7 religious traditions on 5 continents, quote-unquote fundamentalist movements, we found that most of the rank and file and inner core of these movements come from the profession of engineering. That is, these are people who have been trained in techno-scientific rationality. They know how markets operate. A good example of a fundamentalist leader, and here might be a way to make a negotiation or an offer to someone who is quite modern, a figure that Judy Miller has studied, Hassan Turabi in the Sudan, appears before Western audiences in his 3-piece suit, speaks about world trade, says in no uncertain terms, we're going to organize a very modern society that's an alternative to secular modernity, and we're going to do it in this Islamic arc in which there will be no nation states as you understand it, and we'll tell you what women's rights are, but the discussion will be conducted under the auspices of the Quran and Islamic tradition. And he says, quite frankly, when I go back to my people in Sudan, I'll not be wearing the three-piece suit, but the galabiya, and I'll translate these terms and negotiations into their language. We're dealing here with people who have resources, who have goals. They're running on a parallel track in many regards to secular modernity. And on one hand, while they're invoking very strict, quote-unquote, traditional religious precepts, they're modernizing. They're, in their own terms, progressive. And that is a platform in which we can work to both intimidate and negotiate with them in terms of their resources and needs.
Minister Nakayama, on the basis of your experience working in government, what have you heard this morning that would suggest that government is being realistic and sensible in the way in which they handle and recognize the new challenges, or in what way do most governments have their heads in the sand?
一番基本的な問題は、
The most basic issue is
その宗教の教義というものを
the teaching of the religion,
国家が認めているかどうか。
whether or not a state, nation recognizes a certain teaching of the religion, whether or not the teaching or the fundamental core of the religion is incorporated into the, say, legal system of a particular nation, whether or not it is legally adopted or not. I think that is one factor or criteria residing there. In Japan, after the war, under the instruction of GHQ, any armed force should not be supported by the government, was set in the Constitution. And also, we are not supposed to assist any religious groups, but there are many, many religious groups in Japan right now. And lately, as you all may have heard, Omu Shinrikyo sect. This is a new religious group. This can be categorized as one of the fundamental movement. But in the background, there is a Buddhist thought. They have succeeded in collecting young scientists, and they became capable of producing toxic gas. And they had a plan to kill every major personalities in Tokyo. And this had been revealed. And that's why I'm here alive. Perhaps if the discovery of this plan was delayed by half a year, the Japanese government and the politicians may have been all wiped out. Now, what does this incident teach us? When we look at the fundamental religious activity and how that relates to the laws of a nation, and how this would affect to the future of the human beings, how the religious movement can be carried out within the framework of the society, that would affect the domestic policy and foreign policy making very greatly.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. Thank you very much. Madame de Menil, I heard you earlier on speak in a very universalist way, an expression of an appeal to the very best in people, and yet what we have heard today are expressions of particularism. Whether Gigi believes, for example, that what we saw in Bosnia was old-fashioned aggression, or, as it is interpreted very widely, the frustration, ethnic frustration. It seems that there is this very direct conflict now, and I wonder how you would see it.
Before answering your question, there's something I would like to say.
Please.
Totally different. I think there is something to say for traditions. In no sacred books is there written that one should kill the neighbor. All the sacred books have respect for the others. And if we just go back really to the sacred book and try to understand what they say, there's a lot of good things which are totally ignored by some. But I don't want to enter the conflict of many things that have been debated and redebated already. And of course, we all know that the Quran says there's no what is it? No compulsion. Yes, I know that so well, but it just escaped me. There's no compulsion. But I really think sacred books are remarkable, and we just don't dig them or don't understand them anymore in the passion we put. It's all those great debates you have and all the problems that have been evoked here are very real, but they're all due to enormous selfishness, or when the people reach a point that they cannot eat anymore, that they're famished, that they're so unhappy that they're ready to kill, like the bull. It's a story that there was. It said, it was printed in the papers, there was a bull who killed in a slaughterhouse. The butcher was going to kill him. Those things happen. And I don't have any real answer. But I think we should pay more attention to the traditions, the real sacred books. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Alcott, when she spoke before, thank you, Madame, said that words have power, and when we use words, they have consequences. And we ought to be aware and, of course, very careful about words that we use to describe both groups and countries. For example, in the use of the word fundamentalist movement or fundamentalist nation, we could be talking about a perfectly acceptable group representing the majority view in a particular country, and a number of these are indeed allies of the United States. But we are also talking at the same time about radical fundamentalism, which even rejects and takes action against those very states, such as existed yesterday in a bombing episode in Saudi Arabia. So words do have consequences, and an appeal to a finer definition of what it is that we're getting at is important. Gigi Geyer, you wanted to speak.
Yes, Marvin, I've enjoyed this discussion. I'd just like to bring it back for a moment to foreign policy regarding religion, ethnicity, culture. I have been observing through Bosnia, but also through other case studies, other areas I've been covering, some very strange changes in foreign policy outlook, which for all of my searching, I have not been able to really categorize or classify. Part of it is this strange neutralism. There's an idea that nobody must be defeated, nobody must win, nobody must lose. That's why Milosevic is in Dayton, Ohio, having such a great time there. I will bet you that if things go on as they are, he will be invited to the White House in 2 years. Maybe I'm old-fashioned. I'm a primitive from the south side of Chicago. But this is too much for me. I mean, it really is too much for me. It's like asking the rabbi of the synagogue in Berlin to negotiate with Hitler before the war was over. I mean, I think these are the moral questions in this country today, and many of us are concerned about them. I mean, it's a big discussion. I think it is the discussion. For me, the picture that stays in my mind among people who have been always saying never again are some of our people, good people, looking at those satellite photos of the mass killings, the massacres in Bosnia, knowing exactly what happened and doing nothing about it. Now, it doesn't matter if you know, if you don't have the moral courage to form your policy in such a way as you do something. I have worried when every time I've been in Bosnia or Split or Zagreb or Kosovo about the Western militaries standing by and giving over men to be slaughtered. What is this doing to us in the Western world? Do we know? And it all comes down to that question of moral courage. I must say, the new French president has shown a great deal of that, and God bless him. So I think we have to deal with these flawed analyses. Many of the flawed analyses of Bosnia also had to do with the lack of moral courage, because they became excuses for not doing anything. I'll just end with one little very brief vignette. About 2 years ago, I walked into the UN office in Zagreb, which, as I say, I go about every 6 months to look things over. And the head of the UN looked at me sort of excitedly and he said, "Georgianne," we both sat down and he said, "since you've been here, we know now both sides are guilty. Nobody is innocent. The atrocities are balanced." And I sat down and I looked at him, and again, I'm from the south side of Chicago, we're very literal. I said, "Are you joking? I mean, what are you talking about, the atrocities are balanced?" And then we had an very, very fine DCM in the embassy in Zagreb, who of course shared exactly my concerns. And he said, "Georgianne, what's happened is they've become Stockholm syndromized. The UN, the Western militaries there, have been held hostage so long now by the Serbs because of their mandate, because of their, quote, mission mandate, that they now take the side of the aggressors." So I just wanted to add these things, Marvin, because we are talking about, as Judy said, taking the truths, the realities of what is happening, and transforming them into foreign policy. And these are some of the barriers that I have seen in Washington in this administration to translating those realities out there, those satellite pictures. This time we know. This time we really know. That's the problem.
Thank you, Gigi, very much. Gigi. Miss, you are way out of turn. Way out of turn. Way out of turn. You could write a question in and get your answer. Way out of turn. I'm sorry, ladies and gentlemen, for the interruption. Sorry for the interruption. I did want very much. I do not wish to continue this discussion, please. Thank you. You can leave. It's leave, please. There's a way of conducting a discussion. There is a gentlemanly way to conduct a discussion, and you are not doing that, sir. Please, have consideration for those of us who'd like to continue this in an easy, sensible, civilized way. Thank you very much. Goodbye. Goodbye. I want two more people. Esposito, who wanted to talk, and Benjamin Lee, whom I've not heard enough of.
I'd just like to follow up on my two previous colleagues, but mention very quickly that I'm happy to see that people from the south side of Chicago aren't as explicit in their language as those of us from Brooklyn are. But let me make just two brief points. One, and that is that what we need to keep in mind is that religion historically and religious traditions have been a central presence in reality, provided a way of life and guidance, produced saints and fanatics. And part of the problem is there is one book, one sacred book, but you have many interpreters. And so one person's reformer becomes another person's revolutionary and fanatic. The second point is, it seems to me that we need to remember that when we talk about a lot of these issues, that a lot of it, yes, you have religious groups involved in societies, but a lot of what they're addressing have to do with political economy. To go back to what Jim Piscatori and others said earlier, in many of these societies, issues of poverty and illiteracy, maldistribution of wealth, or corruption are forces that have mobilized both secular opposition in the past and now mobilize religious opposition. And finally, I think, yes, in terms of foreign policy makers, the issue, it seems to me today, is how do you combine political pragmatism with moral courage? And I think Bosnia is an absolute example of it, but there are others.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Dr. Lee?
Well, I'm not an expert on religion, but one thing I would like to add is simply that I think one of the things that at least academics don't understand very well is the role of non-government organizations as an international culture. As part of, I was particularly thinking of groups like Women Working Under Muslim Law and groups like this, which have networked across the Islamic world to try and bring court cases from different parts of the world on women's issues. So if a particularly liberal decision has been made, let's say in Indonesia, it might be transmitted to parts of central Russia. So there are many new types of movements and activities which we really don't understand very well. And what the effect of these processes will be in opening things up, I think, is very complicated. Certainly the situation in China is much more complicated than the media and other people have given it up to be. I mean, and I think that we're part of a world where things are being transformed by these circulations. So I just wonder about that.
Well, we lived it. Judy, yes, please.
I just want to add one point to this, the previous point, which is strategic interests, moral courage in an era of shrinking resources. I mean, I think that this is really our challenge, you know, understanding, as Benjamin Lee said, what we're dealing with, and then deploying one's resources in a way. I would like to be in a lot of places in the world where I see injustice and incidents of genocide, but I know that not only wouldn't my government go for it, the American people probably wouldn't want to pay for it. And I think making these distinctions is very crucial and really enormously difficult.
And one of the issues that makes it even more difficult, I think, is that in the environment of shrinking resources, you are also in an environment of expanding technological reach. So that what happens in Bosnia happens in the living room of just about anyone who owns a television set. And that makes it, as we heard yesterday, so difficult for policymakers now. There is a new factor at work that is there every single time a policymaker wants to make up his or her mind about what to do. How is it going to play? Do we have the support of the American people? And I'm sure that this is true not only in the United States, but in countries like Japan or France or others around the world. I saw one hand and then we'll wrap. Yes, Dr.
I was just going to say that one of the interesting aspects of many of the religious leaders' points of view is that it's precisely that realization of the reach of technology that they have been struggling against, so that, for example, television is not viewed as something that everyone has to have within that religious domain. Religious Jews, for example, do not use television very often. I think we're finding that the technology is also something over which there's a competition. Who's going to control that technology and who's going to control the information that comes over it?
Well, a number of the movements did use the technology. If I'm not mistaken, it was the Ayatollah Khomeini who used tapes taped in France and shipped into Iran, which had a major movement. It was the same thing in the bleeding of technology from Helsinki into the Baltic.
But it's control
tapes being
over that
created,
technology.
sent off to Moscow. Gigi?
Very quick point, Marvin. When I interviewed Khomeini in Paris in December of '78, before he went back to Iran, afterwards, Ibrahim Yazdi, one of his assistants, who later became one of those revolving foreign ministers for about 5 minutes, said, I said, why do you have all this technology around you? There was stuff lining the walls and everything, and machines that I didn't understand at all. And he's very seriously, he said, this is the way we're conducting the revolution. When the Ayatollah speaks, we put his voice on 12 recordings. We put those recordings on telephones back to Iran. They are his voice is re-recorded, and they're carried by boys on Hondas all over the country. Later, we would find they would broadcast it from the rooftops, and then people would have the idea in the frenzy of the revolution that he was indeed everywhere, that he was there. But just a very quick second point, Marvin. I don't necessarily believe that technology or that information technology is doing all that. Ted Koppel has given some very thoughtful speeches, which you probably know, where he says television, even the showing of these atrocities, whether Somalia is people starving or Bosnia, only has an effect when the government has no foreign policy itself. I tend to think that's right. There's also something profoundly worrying, something else about Serbia, is that he has been totally able to control the minds of the Serbian people and even many Serbian Americans, people who have access to information from the entire world. So I don't know what that means, but that gives me a very eerie feeling.
Look, Coppola is one of my dearest friends, and he's always right except when he's wrong. And in this particular case, I've talked about this constantly, but the power of television today, of tapes. Think about the Tiananmen massacre time. Chinese students who were hooked in by facts knew what the Western reaction was literally within minutes. They knew exactly the way in which their discontent was ricocheting around the world and coming right back. And it inspired them to move forward. This is not easy now to control. Perhaps it can be controlled, but to put it mildly, it is more difficult to control. In any case, what I can't control is the clock. And so our time's up. But I want to thank really every member of the panel for giving us such a stimulating discussion this morning. Thank you very much to the audience as well.